Hi, my name is Desiree Veit. That's me on the screen there. I like to think of myself as a bit of an artist, but my real day job is actually UI UX design. What is UI UX? Well, UI stands for user interface and UX stands for user experience. The majority of my videos cover something on technology, but some of the stuff is about my daily life, my friends, or that little guy, my puppy. Meet Charles. I'm also a sponsored RaceDot athlete. And what does that mean? Well, RaceDot does in case of emergency wristbands, but I also blog for them at ice.athletes.com. And then I make YouTube videos, and some of them have to do with my adventure racing, which is those mud races, kind of like the Tough Mudder. Oh, there's Charlie joining in. I knew eventually he'd want to say hi to you guys. So, when I'm not running adventure races, I also teach bar, sculpt, and power yoga. So, inversion poses and all of that jazz. I have some yoga videos on here and stuff about business, Twitter, social media, digital strategy, and of course, design. So, let's get back to the UI UX stuff, right? UI stands for user interface and UX stands for user experience. So that's what we're going to talk about today, accessible user experiences and top 5 reasons to build responsive. What is UX? Well, I did already say it stands for user experience, but it's a little bit more than that. User experience is what helps you figure out how a person gets from point A to point B. Getting it a little bit simpler here, just keep it simple, keep it consistent. And what does that mean? Well, in design, and specifically since I work in web design, that means making sure that your navigation is all uniform, and we like to call this universal or global designs. Brian Glass says, expectations frame his or her user experience. So when you're thinking about user experience, you may think previous experience, priority, urgency, luck, newness. These are all the things that somebody might be thinking putting together a form. You want to get through this form and you start off and it asks for your name, your email, and then it asks for your address, but all of it's out of order, and maybe it has you put in your state, but it only wants you to type in your full state name. So I'm in Iowa, so it has you put in IOWA instead of IA, but it doesn't specify that. Or think about how many times you've filled out a phone field and it requires dashes, but it never tells you, and so you figure that out after 50 different tries and no error messages. The whole point of UX design is really to figure out the user experiences, what's going wrong, and then helping the user get from point A to point B. And maybe it goes on all the way to a Z, but you're just trying to figure out how to efficiently get a user through the process with a clean, easy user experience. Now, a good user experience is one where the user doesn't even have to think about it. It's something that feels like it was always there, always meant to be there. So I put a home automation system into my house recently, and I started to automate my porch lights. So every time I open up my front door, the light turns on. I don't even think about it anymore, but sometimes, you know, I'm opening up the door to let my puppy out, and I just think, you know, I don't know why I didn't do this a long time ago, and that kind of thing. It's one of those experiences where you're just like, voila. Smartphones, I'm sure a lot of people feel that way about their smartphone, going from old analog, and all of the conveniences, and then at the same time, some of those things get so addictive that you kind of wish they weren't so easy. But that leads me into user-centered design and iterative design. We're not really going to talk very in depth about these, but they go hand in hand. I highly recommend looking up the terms, but it's it's a huge part of this design process, and how usability and usefulness are the outcome. And that is user-centered design. User-centered design is basically user experience design, because you are putting the user first, rather than the stakeholder or the business needs per se. And that's not to say that those aren't important too, because obviously you have your requirements and you do have to keep your stakeholders happy, but you don't want to do it while impeding the user. So, who came up with this? Don Norman. Who is Don Norman? Who is Don Norman? Don Norman works for Apple, and he coined the term while putting together one of the first ever user experience documents. And I have those handy dandy quotes here that tell you a little bit more about why he invented it or how he invented it. So, quoting Don Norman, "I invented the term because I thought human interface and usability were too narrow. I wanted to cover all the aspects of the person's experience with the system, including industrial design, graphics, the interface, the physical interaction, and the manual." In the beginning, we really had to think about usability. These are two separate quotes, by the way, because the early computers, and for that matter, almost all early products that used computers, were unworkable, unusable, not understandable, because they tended to be done by engineers who were much more concerned about getting the thing to work, not about can anybody understand it or use it, because most of the people that used it were technical people. So let's look at the process and talk a little bit more about what we're actually going to go through. And a big part of today's video is going to cover responsive design, because I try to make most of the applications I work on anyway part of a responsive design process. And responsive design is basically a squishy website, and a squishy website or responsive website is one where you can have it at full screen or desktop size, which is probably 1200 pixels, minimum maybe 900 in width. But if you slowly make the screen smaller, it adjusts maybe down to a tablet size, around 700, all the way down to a mobile size, which can vary depending on your mobile device, which may get down all the way to 450. But, and I have best practices or standards listed, I think, on my blog at DesiraeVeit.com, DesiraeVeit.com, if you do want to see the recommendations for CSS variations. Anyway, so what's involved in the design process if you're building with mobile in mind? Oh, and why is building for mobile even important? Well, the majority of users are on their phone constantly, and we will talk about that more just in a second. We're also going to talk about UI, user interface, UX, user experience. We're already talking about that. And then I just explained to you what responsive design is, basically, which is building mobile sites in mind. But it's more than that. It's building mobile first. And mobile first means you, when you're building out your CSS, I like to use frameworks. If I had to recommend only one CSS framework, I would say Bootstrap, which also goes hand in hand with Sass, which I love, and you should look up both of those. Sass is SASS, and that's a preprocessor for, you can use it for Haml, you can use it for Sass, you can use it for Slim, and those all kind of shorten up your code, make it easier to look at, make it easier to write, but it also does a whole bunch of math. It makes it easier for you to put images together. It's a handy tool to have. So here is the process, and I took this from IA, but it basically shows you how everything comes together in such a nice way. And it's from Information Architects Incorporated. But anywho, it shows you the business case. The business side is basically the red side, visual design being the bottom right, and UX being the primary in the middle, with the actual prototype and everything else being up top. So it shows you it's a very central point of this process. Visual design. So I believe that design kind of goes in a certain order. There's print designers who work with very high resolution images, and this is not to say this is everything that these different types of designers do or are capable of, but it will just give you a nice overview. So a print designer probably works with magazines, flyers, posters, and the like, and they make very high resolution, and it needs to be high resolution, Illustrator or Photoshop or whatever they're building it in, probably Illustrator. And they do that so that it comes out nice and crisp after it's been printed, right? Now we talk about graphic design. Graphic designers probably have the same skill sets. Anything to do with really Illustrator, Photoshop, whatever. But if they're web designers, they probably also know how to optimize those images and make them so that they still look nice, but the file size isn't going to bog down a website and slow it down. They may have a few other skills in there too that go along with, logo making and the like. But I would say where that crosses over the web design into the user interface designer is that the UI designer actually can do a bit of code, which means they can probably write HTML and CSS at the very least. Hopefully they can also do a little bit of JavaScript, jQuery, Ajax. If you've ever worked with a preprocessor, those go right in line with HTML, CSS. And I don't just mean that, I also mean the latest of those codes, but being able to work with them on multiple browsers and optimize for browsers. So most companies that are going to hire you are not going to expect their websites just to look good on Chrome. They're also going to expect it to look good on Firefox and Internet Explorer. And Internet Explorer has all of its own special nuances or quirks or whatever you want to say. And a lot of times, especially if you're working in big business, corporate, or government, or whatever, they're going to expect those websites to go all the way back to maybe IE8 or IE7 or even IE6, 5, blah, 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 blah. And if they do, you're going to need to know how to get the code to work. And there are hacks, which don't recommend necessarily, but sometimes they're a necessary evil, especially for Internet Explorer, because those older browsers they don't follow all of the latest web standards, or they don't work with the latest HTML5, which is funny because HTML they've been working on HTML5. It's not a brand new thing. It's something that's been going on, I think, since 2004. So, and it will just keep getting better and better. But yeah, so HTML5, CSS3, and then if you can work on different platforms for coding, like I like Coda for Mac, but for work I use Dreamweaver, and I also have to use Eclipse, which is really nice for Subversion, which allows you to keep track of different versions across multiple developers, so that if anybody breaks code or if the client decides they want something that you've previously built to be put back onto dev or prod or whatever, then you're able to quickly do that. As a designer, for applications that support big data, design means more than just cutting-edge technology solutions. I believe it means building a user experience, and that's everything that we've been talking about already. It's the big picture, getting the user again from point A to point B all the way to Z. and that there's a whole process from the concrete to the abstract when you're starting with strategy, and then you're building out the requirements alongside of a business analyst, the project manager, the client, and you're working toward a finished product based on a timeline, a deadline, probably alongside at least a small team, if not a huge one. So you narrow it down to the scope, and then you start building out maybe a wireframe. Hopefully you have time for a wireframe. If not, maybe you jump right into the prototyping. That gets approved. Then you might go into user testing, or you might start doing the development version, which then is handed off to probably a developer who's building it out in, C++ or Java, .NET, whatever it's finished. Maybe it's in Ruby. Whatever the finished product is going to be in, you've probably already built the front end code. They do the object-oriented code, the back end. And so that's the structure. The aesthetics are pretty much already set, or they should be, and that's part of the initial template. So if there's a difference from if you're freshly building out a website versus you're adding on to it, or you're doing the maintenance and just building a new page. Hopefully at that point, aesthetics are at the very, very beginning of the project, but as revisions go on, the site can change drastically, especially if you're managing something over the course of many, many years. Go back and look at, there is a website, and I think it's called Way Machine or Time something. It lets you look at old websites. You just should Google something along those lines, and you'll probably find the site I'm talking about, or maybe I'll look it up for you guys. So, this is what we design for, right? And this is the reality. We hope that somebody is going to land on a web page and they are just going to read everything that we put on there because we have thoroughly thought this out and the client wants absolutely every piece of information possible on there. But in reality, they are looking for a specific piece of information and they are jumping around. They normally probably start from the top left and read right, and then they jump down really, really quickly with their eyeballs just moving around, and then they just happen to click on some random link that wasn't even really what you'd hoped that they would click on. So that's why we need to narrow everything down to just the essential content, the brand, the primary navigation, the content, and then the call to action, and somewhere on the page, hopefully, if it's important, the contact information. Not every website requires that, but if you're especially doing something with sales or a branding website, you probably want to have some way for the client to contact you. There's all this other stuff that we could probably talk about, but I'm not going to get into on this video, maybe on another one. And that stuff includes things like color theory, keeping it simple, fonts, and there are a zillion different kinds of web fonts that aren't just the standard ones that you're probably currently working with. Google Fonts, Font Squirrel, Glyphicons, web fonts. I love Glyphicons. Keeping things consistent, which I did kind of already touch on, but space. What I mean by that is white space, and if you went to college for design, you've probably heard that a lot. Balance, purposeful information, purposeful design, having a purpose for what you're doing, and that goes into this little image here. So you see the button on the left, and you just think click. I mean, that looks like a button. The next one over is a little flatter, and you go, oh, okay, that's a button. The last one, you're like, well, I can't even tell if it's clickable. It's not underlined, it's not blue, it's not a button-looking thing. Is it a button? So I hover over it, and maybe the designer decided to disable the cursor. So then you're really confused because it is actually a link, or maybe not, I don't know. I like to have feedback. User feedback is an essential part, especially if you don't end up getting an opportunity to do user testing or evaluation testing, or QA. I mean, who knows how small your project is, especially if it's just your own personal blog or portfolio. So feedback, even if it's just comments, is essential. Analytics, there are dozens of free analytics tools, like Google Analytics is my favorite. And code and web standards compatibility. So if you want to learn more about that, go to w3schools.org. Now, successful development is collaborative. It's cross-disciplinary, it's a team effort, and many of these disciplines are not at all mentioned in this presentation, but I highly recommend that you watch more of my videos and you can learn more about the rest of the team that works alongside designers. Sorry, I've skipped over all of you because you are important. Now, prototyping. This is the functional part, right? So we've already done our wireframe. We roughly have things laid out. They're probably basically the equivalent of pencil drawings, although we probably used a tool, something like, I don't know, Mockingbird, or I don't know, there's dozens and dozens of wireframing tools. But the prototyping, if we are UI designers, which I am, basically I use whatever CSS or framework I already have laid out for the website, and a lot of the projects I work on are Java, so we're going to talk about them as if they're Java projects, and maybe we're making them into JSPs, which means I can probably do a lot of my stuff in, hopefully I don't have to do some crazy Java mix-up and it is just a JSP, which means I can write in HTML and CSS, or Sass, I hope. And you just basically lay out the web page like you want it to look like and get that approved, and then, hand it off to a developer who may or may not write inline styles, so you're going to have to go back through and make sure to put all of your classes in properly again. But that is the basic, I've really oversimplified, prototyping. And if you're doing this with responsive in mind, because like I said, mobile is important, then you've probably also laid out either multiple style sheets for the different layouts, or you've used a framework like Bootstrap or some other framework that already has the basics for responsive design put into it. And why is this important? Like I said, mobile technology is important because 58% of people can't even go 1 hour without checking out their phones, and the majority of people these days have mobile devices. So it's becoming more and more important that we build for mobile. So, top 5 reasons to build responsive. And again, responsive basically means we're building for mobile phones, smartphones, however you want to say it. Responsive strategy. Now, for each of these, I've added in a quote. They're not my quotes, but I have referenced the original people who said them or wrote them or whatever. Just because I can. One man's challenge is another man's roadback. Let's go back to that last one. Responsive strategy. So, the details are not the details, they make the design. Charles. Blah, blah, blah. Responsive design offers users the ability to view content in the browsers custom to their viewport. The viewport is basically the area that you're actually normally looking at on the screen. And the strategy for responsive strategy just basically means you're keeping it in mind and building responsive. So you know ahead of time when you first start that you're building out your style sheet with everything in mind. And if you're doing it in Sass, you could do stuff with mix-ins, which, again, we're not going to go terribly into, but once you start playing with Sass, you'll know more about what I'm talking about. One man's challenge is another man's roadblock. If a user can't find it, it doesn't exist. So true. Let's talk about a couple examples of this, shall we? Losing loyalty because of bad date of birth experience. These are real examples, people. So you click on the date picker and you get this. Do you think you're immediately going to have any freaking clue what that means? This next one is the ESPN's password strength with happy green check mark. Again, this is real, or was at least. I don't know if it's still this way. So you've chosen your password and you're typing it in, and you get this happy green check mark that's telling you, oh, your password, you think green check mark means, yeah, I did a good, strong password, right? Except for at the end of that it says bad. So wouldn't you expect that check mark to actually be red? People associate green, orange, red. Green is go, orange is maybe slow down, or I don't know, something mild. Red is hot. Red, stop. You did something bad. Go back. Error. So that doesn't make sense, does it? Out of order. Remember how I talked about putting in an address? When you're putting one in, you probably want it to be similar to something people are used to seeing, which is why a lot of times when you're filling out your address in form fields online, they actually resemble something more along the lines of mail. And what I mean by that is snail mail. Have you ever noticed you put in your name, then you put in your street address, then you put in your city, state, and zip? It's the same order normally that you would do that. So when you're creating new things, don't reinvent the wheel. Think about things that people are already using and make it easy for them. Something that they would already do in a certain logical order. This is not it. And mandatory optional fields on LinkedIn. So please include a personal note. This is optional. Oh wait, if you actually try to send this, it's not going to be optional. You're going to get an error and they're going to make you do it over again. Yeah, that is called a bad user experience. Moving on. Know your users. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so an interface is worth 1,000 pictures. Knowing your users. You can do this with personas. You can learn more about ethnography if you want to look that up. But basically, analytics will help with this, doing some research, figuring out your target audience, and all of those fun stuff will help you get a better picture of who you're building for. Hopefully, if you're building with a team and you have a project manager or a business analyst, they will give you a rough idea of who the stakeholders are and what type of user or person is actually going onto your site. So, for example, my videos are probably for new to intermediate designers, or people who like sports, or people who just are bored and looking around for a whole bunch of videos. I normally think of my video diaries just as something for me and maybe my family, but I know some other friends and people probably watch them also. Technology and solutions. It is important to stay on top of what is the latest and greatest, but that doesn't mean that you should specifically cater to them just because somebody hears some jargon term or some hot new thing and just add it to your site just because. No. You should try to pick these based off of what is best for your client, what is best for the team, what you're familiar with. You've got to think about, do I have time to implement this new thing? Do I have time to learn this new thing? Or should we go with what's existing just because? Is there going to be time later to fix it and make it better? Is it going to fit the requirements? Sometimes it's all of the above, sometimes it's not. So you have to be able to keep a nice balance of that. Again, here's a few examples of some tools, code and whatnot that you can look up for later. And accessibility. What is accessibility? Well, if you're building for big corporations, airlines, or government websites, this is legally required. It's called 508 compliance. Accessibility means maybe you have users who are blind and they have an e-reader, or maybe they're colorblind and they can't see certain colors. So if you put those colors on top of each other with the background text and the actual text being both of them, they might blend in. There's all kinds of different things that can go into this, but part of that is, okay, so you have an e-reader and you might add in something called skip navigation, and I have an example of that here on the first one, CMS Gov's website. And you probably can't normally see this unless you're using it, but you can tab between their navigation and hit enter. The same goes for drop downs. Some drop downs are not at all 508 compliant, and this goes because maybe you're using a mobile device and you can't use it at all because the person did it in jQuery or something, but they didn't make it so that it stays. The second you try to go into the drop down, it just disappears. All of that also applies for being able to tab through the site, or the visibility, what's being read. Pictures are a big part of this, having alt tags with pictures so that they're read. And all of that also goes into your SEO, or search engine optimization, which helps your website come up in search engine so that it's easier to find your website. That goes all into accessibility. Browser compatible experiences. We've kind of gone over this a little bit, but I'm going to pick on Nike a little bit here. I believe this is Nike and Chrome and Nike and IE. Again, Nike and Chrome, IE. Thank you for watching my video and sticking with me. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments or find me on Twitter. I'm at Desiree V. I really appreciate you watching. Please subscribe if you like the video, thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. Here's a few recommendations for books that go right along with this topic. Have a great one.